There aren't too many gospel lessons, teachings by Jesus that trouble me, but this is indeed one of them. I find this the most troubling of all of Jesus' teachings. Just as a reminder, this is a continuation of Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. So we have two versions of Jesus' teaching. In Matthew's Gospel, it's the Sermon on the Mount, the one that we know all too well. And then there's the Sermon on the Plain that is described by Luke in the 6th chapter of his Gospel. So today's Gospel lesson is a continuation of the Sermon on the Plain. And much like the Beatitudes, you have to imagine that there are all sorts of people who are gathered to hear Jesus preach and teach. There are folk from all walks of life. There are the rich and the powerful and the influential. And then in that same gathering, there's the poor, the marginalized, the dispossessed, and those who have lost their reason to live. That Jesus is able to bring this cosmopolitan group of people together for a common cause. And so at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, or the Sermon on the Plain rather, Jesus begins to say, "Blessed are those who are poor, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who are trying to find their way in life," and just a series of blessings. And of course, the challenge that Jesus places to those who have is that what you have, you should be willing to share, right? So Jesus gives comfort to those who are in need, and at the same time, he encourages those who have resources and those who have material things to share with those who are lacking. I can only imagine that there are folk in that group who are saying, "This is a bit too much for me. I wish the poor and the dispossessed and the marginalized well, but why do I have to give up what I have worked so hard to procure to those who are without? Why should I have to part with my resources for those who didn't work or earn what I have?" I suspect that there were people in that gathering who probably said, "I'm not interested any longer in hearing what Jesus has to say." Because the moment Jesus begins to preach the Sermon on the Plain, there is an inversion of the social world order. Instead of celebrating those who have and chastising those who have not, Jesus turns the world order upside down, and for his listeners, he says, "But this is what the kingdom of God is like. We share in the economy of God's kingdom. No one goes without in God's kingdom. Everyone is fed in God's kingdom. We watch out for one another in God's kingdom. There is no division in the kingdom of heaven. There aren't the dispossessed, the marginalized. There's no rich and powerful. It's just one, the human race, the people of God." And so Jesus turns the social world order upside down, and what he says is the things that matter to you, the things that you cling so tightly to, do not matter to God. It is not an indicator of how blessed you are. The world would say that. The world in which we live seems to suggest that the more you have, the more blessed you are. The less you have, somehow you miss the blessings. But then I want to be like Jesus, who had very little, but he had a deep and abiding relationship with God. And so Jesus begins to teach about what it means to live in the presence of God. That if you're going to be a part of this new missionary endeavor, where we begin to change the social order and the social structure so that everyone matters and everyone is seen equally in the eyes of God, then it means that we must be willing to share what we have. We must be willing to see our neighbor as we see ourselves. And I'm sure that was troubling to some. And I think that there were a couple of folk, families, who probably gathered their belongings and they said, I don't want to do that. But then one would think that after the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus would have softened his message, but he actually doesn't. He doubles down. And then he says, okay, to those of you who have left and have decided to stay with me, I have this to say to you. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. From anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away what you have, do not ask for them again. And then, to top it all off, he says, and then I want you to do to others as you would have them do to you. As if the first series of blessings and curses weren't enough, now Jesus is saying, if people abuse you and mistreat you, instead of getting angry and upset and vengeful and spiteful, and instead of living in a world of anxiety and frustration, pray for them and love them. I suspect that there were people then as now scratching their head saying, this simply doesn't make any sense. It goes against everything I was taught. It goes against everything I have observed in the world. The world doesn't live like this. The world doesn't behave this way. I've never been told that I have to pray for my enemies, and I certainly don't want to pray for people who abuse me. I'm sure you don't want to pray for people who abuse you. It's hard to pray for people who don't see us in the way God sees us. I remember several years ago, and for me this was truly a life-changing event. Over my almost 30 years of ordained ministry, this singular event has perhaps made the most profound impact on how I see abuse. One day I was driving. I was in Baltimore at the time, but it wasn't that much longer that I would be here in Brooklyn. I was driving, and it was a beautiful day, and on a very busy thoroughfare. And I went through a green light when the light changed from red to green, and off to my right, I saw this man beating this woman. And I am talking, saints, I'm not talking playful hits. I'm talking the kind where I was like, oh my God, he's going to kill her. And I had to try to figure out what I was going to do. So I noticed behind me was a car of ladies. There were about 3 of them in the car. And they saw what I saw. Because they started slowing down, I slowed down. And I had to figure out what I was going to do. Am I going to get involved in this domestic situation, or am I just going to just go by because I don't know these people? I don't want to get involved. I don't want to be injured. I don't know if the guy had a gun. I don't know. I just didn't know any of that. And I'm sure the people behind me didn't know either. But we both, at the same time, decided to pull over. And somehow the woman was in the passenger side of the car. And she didn't want to get out of the car. He kept trying to pull her out of the car. She wouldn't get out. And so he just started punching her. And I mean, I felt every blow he was giving her. And I said, I can't let this go. So I got out of my car, and the ladies behind me got out of their cars, and we kept saying, listen, leave her alone. She can come with us. I said, she's more than welcome to come with me. I'll take her wherever she needs to go. But she wouldn't leave. And the guy just kept hitting her. And finally, he was able to free her hands. She was holding on to the top part of where the window. And instead of he could have easily have grabbed her and pushed her out. I think he just wanted to be violent. She wasn't a large woman. He could have easily have overpowered her if he wanted her out of the car without hitting her. I just think he took satisfaction in doing it. And I remember he finally got her out of the car and he drove off. And so finally the ladies and I said, come with us, because there was a police station not far away, and we were just going to take her so that if she wanted to file a report, she could. She started going with the ladies, so she was going to ride with the ladies, and finally the guy drove back around. And he kept saying to her, come on back here, come on, get in this car. I think he knew that we were probably going to take her to the police station, because I was going to follow them to the police station to lodge a report right along with her. I was just like, this was just unacceptable. But she went back with him and got in the car. And I often wondered what ever happened to this woman whose name I did not know, person I didn't know. And there were 4 of us, 3 ladies and this priest who was trying to liberate this woman from abuse, who only went back. And my heart sank when I saw her get back into the car. And as the clergy and Paul Olson will tell you, every time in Advent, when we do the Advent collection, Paul says to me, who's going to be the beneficiary of the Advent offering? I always say a battered women's shelter. If you notice, at Grace, every Advent, our offering goes to some shelter that's helping battered women or families that have been abused. I felt helpless. My heart sank, and even talking about it now, it just breaks my heart, because I wish I could have done more. And I wish she had the strength to leave him. And so I suspect that in this crowd with Jesus today are folks who are saying, Jesus, you don't know what it's like to be abused, and you're asking me to pray for my abuser. Help me to make sense of what you're asking me to do. And even I, who, though I wasn't abused and I saw an abuser abuse a woman, I'm saying, Jesus, what are you asking of me? How do we do that? How do we make peace with our enemies? How do we love them? How do we bless those who hate us and curse us? How do we pray for those who abuse us, Jesus? You have to help us make sense of all of this. And I think what Jesus is getting at is that as hard as it is to pray for people who don't recognize your humanity, if you don't figure out how to pray for them and how to love them, you will always be incarcerated in your own self-imposed jail. As hard as it is, in order to be free from your oppressor, this is what Jesus is saying, by the way. As hard as it is, you have to be able to let him or her go through the power of prayer and forgiveness. Otherwise, you will get up every morning bitter and angry and frustrated. We perhaps have folk in our parish who get up every morning bitter, angry, and frustrated because of what's happening in our country. I know I do. I stopped watching the news. I can't take anymore. And the only way for me to not be bitter and angry at the record number of people who are losing their jobs, good people, people who had this country's welfare at the heart of what they did and what they do, have lost their jobs and now have to try to figure out, how do I pay my mortgage? How do I feed my family? How do I take care of my basic needs? We have people who have made careers in the military, keeping us safe, watching out for our well-being and the common life of this country, all of a sudden be dismissed without cause. We have the elderly and those who are challenged physically or educationally have to now worry about their basic needs. And so I understand what Jesus is saying, because we are in that moment when Jesus says you can either get upset at what they're doing or you can find it inside of you to bless them and to pray for them. It doesn't mean that you accept what they're doing, but it says you will not incarcerate me. You won't take away my personal freedom to be happy and to be at peace. And Jesus, speaking to people who are marginalized, he's saying, I'm trying to tell you this is how you are liberated. As hard as it is, the burden is on the oppressed to be free of the oppressor. And the way we free ourselves from the oppressor is to pray for them, is to wish them well. Not what they do, but we have to be able to say, I can't live like this for the rest of my life. I don't want to be angry every day. I know what they're doing. It is ungodly. It is unjust. It is unmerciful. And yet we know that it is not the ways of God. But what is the way of God is the power and impact of prayer. And I know that's difficult. But we're better than that. And God demands more out of us if we're going to deal with what's happening to us in this country. I feel abused. I'm sure many of you feel abused by what's happening in our country. It may not directly be happening to you at this moment, but I just feel abused because I see innocent people hurting. And I know that we have parishioners who have family members who are hurting and who feel powerless to do anything about it. But the power of prayer is such that it gives us perspective on how to live our lives productively. So think about today's Old Testament lesson in Genesis. It's a wonderful story. Unfortunately, we get the tail end of this story with Joseph and his brothers. I love it. If you haven't read Joseph's story, you should, in the book of Genesis 37, chapter 37. Remember Joseph's brothers, 10 brothers. He has 12, but Benjamin, the youngest, is not a part of what happens. So Joseph has 10 brothers, and his brothers are jealous of him. He's the favorite of the father. He gets a nice little coat from his dad, and his father just loves him. And the brothers are jealous of him. And remember, Joseph has the ability to tell dreams. So, Dad loves me, you get a nice shiny coat, and you tell dreams, right? You have skills and property and things we don't have, and we're older than you, and how is it that you have these things? And so the brothers decide one day that they're going to throw him in a pit and sell him into slavery. And they do that. They take him out, and they throw him in a pit, and then they sell him to traders, and then Joseph ends up in Egypt and enslaved for many years. And he is in jail because of a false trumped-up charge from Potiphar's wife that he tried to just violate her. And of course, Potiphar, who's powerful, believed his wife, and Joseph is put in prison. And what liberates Joseph out of prison is that he has the ability to tell dreams. And so Pharaoh used him to interpret dreams, and that got him his freedom. And not only did it buy his freedom, but it also allowed him to be elevated as the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. And so in today's text, Joseph's brothers, because there's a famine in the land, Joseph's brothers come because they are in need of grain. They're in need of food. And Joseph sees his brothers, but notice the text tells us that they didn't recognize him. And Joseph, the first thing he does is he asks about his father. Is dad still alive? Is my father still alive? And the brothers are perhaps in a state of confusion because they have no idea who this guy is. They just know that their brother was sold into slavery years ago, and certainly he would not have been he would not have been elevated to the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. But he has been, and he is. And finally, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And what I love about this text is, now that Joseph is powerful, having gone through slavery in Egypt, abuse, mistreatment, false charges, someone who was separated from his father and his siblings and his mother and didn't grow up in his homeland, Joseph had every reason to be upset with his brothers. And he was powerful. He could have done anything he wanted to his brothers to exact vengeance. But Joseph says to his brothers, don't worry, you're safe. And Joseph says, I now realize that all that I went through in Egypt was according to God's purposes. That God had a purpose for my life here in Egypt. And because God had a purpose for my life in Egypt, I cannot be angry at you. Joseph's experience in Egypt allowed him to see his brothers in a way that his brothers could not see him. And Joseph had the spirit of forgiveness. He was able to pray for his enemies, his brothers who sold him into slavery. He was able to pray for them and to forgive them. That's the hard work that Jesus calls us to in today's gospel lesson, and we have that modeled for us in Genesis. As much as we may not like it, in order that we might be free and live the life that God has called us to live, we have to pray for our enemies. You have to pray for those who don't mean you well. Because to do so will grant you your spiritual freedom. To not pray for your enemies is to not be fully aware of the cost of losing your personal life and your integrity. I often wondered what happened to that woman. And if she was in this crowd with Jesus, with all of her bruises showing, I think she would say, Jesus, I want to follow you. You have to help me understand this one. I know we have people at Grace Church. You're having a hard time. Don't give up on Jesus. Just ask Jesus to help you to make sense of it. It's hard following Jesus. But it's good, it's true, and it's liberating. And it is the work of God. May you be blessed. May you find the strength and the wisdom and be encouraged to pray for those who hurt you, for those who speak ill of you, for those who do not wish you well. Pray for them so that you may be free. Amen.